An immeasurable wealth of riches, sparkling gold, shimmering silver, breathtaking gems, dazzling jewelry, the stuff that dreams are made of. All this treasure went down on a legendary 17th century Spanish galleon called La Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas. Since that time, men have lusted mightily for those fabulous riches. Reaching out across the centuries, they have sacrificed home, hearth, and even their very lives in the quest for the Maravillas. On January 14, 1992, actress Sybil Shepherd caused quite a stir when she appeared on The Tonight Show wearing an unusual and extremely expensive piece of jewelry. It wasn't Cartier or Tiffany. The emerald cross that adorned her had come from the bottom of the ocean. It had gone down along with untold millions of dollars of other treasures on La Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas, a Spanish galleon that sank in 1656. The Emerald Cross had been salvaged by a modern-day treasure hunter, Herbert Herbo Humphreys, Jr. For Humphreys, the experience of going out to search for the treasure of the Maravillas was extraordinary. He was living out a lifelong dream.
The romance to it is you're going on an adventure with like-minded people, whether they be archaeologists or researchers or writers or filmmakers or ex-soldiers or airmen or pilots or divers. They all share this dream, from the cook on a ship to the captain to the investors. And it's going after an actual time capsules in history that have been untouched for hundreds of years. And after doing the research, you feel an affinity toward the people that were on that ship, and as though you know them.
Like Humphreys, treasure hunter Bob Marks had been dreaming for many years of finding the Maravillas, of holding its amazing treasures in his hands. These were dreams that had begun during boyhood.
Every kid dreams of finding a sunken or buried treasure. We've all read Treasure Island, saw movies with John Wayne and other people finding treasures, and at a very early age I started to dive with a homemade helmet. And when I was 15, I went from reading to actually finding the treasure.
In 1960, Marks began his search for the legendary Maravillas, not on the high seas, but at the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, Spain. It is there that thousands of documents relating to the ship's tragedy and treasure are kept. Before Marks could venture out to sea, he needed to know the entire history surrounding the wreck. For in that history lay important clues as to where he would eventually look and what he could expect to find. Every story of treasure is also a tale of tragedy, for men do not readily surrender what is valuable to them. This is no more true than in the story of La Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas, Our Lady of the Marvels. On January 4th, 1656, this Spanish galleon, traveling in a fleet of 22 ships, sank off the coast of the Bahamas. It was one of hundreds of treasure-laden ships that were lost during thousands of treacherous voyages back to Spain from the New World in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Many ships fell victim to hurricanes or pirates. Sometimes they crashed on the reefs or collided with another ship, as was the case of the Maravillas. Whatever the cause, some might say these disasters were ultimately divine justice. for the treasures on these ships were ill-gotten. Conquistadores had been sent over by the Spanish monarchies to conquer the indigenous peoples of South America. Those who weren't murdered were enslaved. In Potosi, Peru, as well as Mexico, they were forced underground to mine and mint the gold, silver, and other natural riches of their lands. Each year, vast fleets of Spanish galleons sailed back to Spain with fabulous riches, treasures that shined brightly during an otherwise dark and turbulent period of European history. The riches of the New World often exacted a heavy price. The perilous and sometimes doomed voyages of the Spanish galleons are not just the focus of historians. Modern-day treasure hunters are intent on learning everything they can about Spanish shipwrecks. With millions at stake, they believe knowledge can be truly enriching.
The Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas, Our Lady of the Marvels, was one of the most significant lost treasure ships in the history of the world because of not only the huge amount of treasure cargo it carried, but also because of the significant number of lives that were lost on it. The Maravillas, without question, is the single most famous treasure wreck in the history of the Bahamas.
According to the official records of the day, the Maravillas carried 5 million pesos and 506 large silver bars, some $50 million in today's money. There was also a fortune in jewelry. Its passengers had bought fine pieces like these from traders that had gone to the Far East. Plus, the Maravillas held untold millions in smuggled treasure, gold, silver, and gems. Some of its bounty came from a previous ship that had sunk off the coast of Ecuador and was then salvaged. Whether the treasure fell victim to a curse, a coincidence, or just bad luck, no one can say for sure. But it all went down once again when the Maravillas sank, taking along 605 souls. On January 1st, 1656, the Maravillas, along with 21 other vessels, set sail from Havana. The ship's course was the usual route for galleons returning to Spain. They would sail north, try to sight the Florida Keys, and then hug the coast of Florida. When they sighted Cape Canaveral, they knew they were far enough north that they could shift to a northeasterly direction, head for Bermuda, then past the Azores toward Spain, some 1,200 to 1,400 miles away. The Maravillas held 58 bronze cannons. English and Dutch pirates were a frequent problem for Spanish galleons. In addition to grain, sugar, food, medicine, and other supplies, the ship carried a great deal of treasure, the spoils of the New World. It was carrying far more than it was meant to bear. 650 souls were on board the Maravillas: the admiral of the fleet, the ship's captain, his crew, soldiers in service to the king, royal officials, noblemen, colonial profiteers, and their servants. Among the passengers was Dr. Don Diego Portichuelo de Ribadeneyra. He was a priest, a lawyer, and head of the Spanish Inquisition in Lima. Dr. Diego would be later immortalized in the annals of the Maravillas for 2 reasons. He was one of 45 people who survived the wreck, and he not only lived to tell about it, he wrote the entire story in a book that was published 1 year later. Dr. Diego's journal offers a unique eyewitness account of a shipwreck. In a blow-by-blow description of the Maravillas' final hours, he puts modern readers on board the ship with vivid details. 3 days into the voyage, the ship was heading toward the Bahamas Channel. Suddenly, the Maravillas was struggling with strong currents that were pulling it into shallow waters and the treacherous reefs of Little Bahama's bank.
At 10 o'clock in the evening, the boatswain's shouts woke me up. From the prow, they reported a low depth. As I learned later, they found that the waters were whitish and washing, which are indications that the bottom is near and that their soundings revealed 13 fathoms. Everyone was in an uproar, and I jumped from the bed, dressed hurriedly, and went on deck, where I found some alarmed, others confused, and everyone giving opinions about what should be done. Dr. Don Diego Portichuelo de Ribadenera.
As all returning ships going to Spain, after leaving Havana, they go up through the Bahama Channel between the Bahamas and east coast of Florida. And Maravilla, being the Almiranta, or the Admiral's ship, was in the vanguard, the lead ship.
A Maravilla's crewman fired a cannon to warn the other ships in the fleet of the dangerous reefs. But it led to confusion, and in the darkness, another vessel rammed the Maravillas in its bow, and she began to rapidly take on water. The ship was doomed. The sights and sounds of the tragedy of the Maravillas come to life through Dr. Diego's words. He writes how, in their last moments, as the passengers and crew crowded onto the ship's stern castle, they begged God for help, for mercy, for redemption.
Many bit their flesh, asking me to exchange their pain for the satisfaction of their guilt. The weeping of some, the sobbing of others, the discord of the voices, the gloominess of the night, the noise of the wind, the crest of the waves and their abating, the agonizing of some. The taking away by the currents of others caused such fear, surprise, confusion, and horror that I felt that it was beyond human endurance to continue delivering the Holy Sacrament and the penitents. Dr. Don Diego Portichuelo de Ribadenera.
When the ship sank, within several hours, the entire stern castle, the poop deck, broke off, all 3 stories of it, and fell to starboard, sending hundreds of people into the sea. 605 people died in the shipwreck. So you have a tremendous Spanish maritime tragedy, as well as a treasure beyond treasures.
With so much treasure at stake, and the Maravillas below just 40 feet of water, the Spaniards initiated salvage activities almost immediately after the tragedy. When the Spanish galleon La Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas sank in 1656, there was little chance Spain's King Philip IV would simply forget about the huge amounts of treasure she was carrying. The ship went down 40 miles off the coast of the Bahamas, and her position was noted by survivors, as well as another ship in the fleet. Because the Maravilla sank in only 40 feet of water, divers who could hold their breath for minutes at a time were recruited for the task. Most of these men were slaves.
And shortly afterwards, when the Spaniards initiated the salvage efforts, at time they had as many as 6 vessels there with salvors, and quite a number of those were killed. Actually, a couple were actually eaten by sharks. And then the strange thing was that over a period of 3 years, there were 16 different salvage vessels involved, and 12 of them, after picking up treasure, returning to different ports like Santo Domingo and Havana, were lost.
The apparent curse hanging over the Maravillas would claim even more lives during the salvaging of the ship's treasure.
On one particular occasion, a slave diver named Pedro was sent down to remove some cannon because it was covering silver bars and they couldn't pull the bars out from under it. And the gun was unstable, and as he tried to shift this grapnel so they could move it, the cannon fell on him and crushed him. His diving mate struggled to free him, and finally at the last minute literally tore the body from under the cannon, raced with it to the surface, and he died within a few minutes because his lungs were crushed.
Among the key participants in early salvage efforts of the Maravillas was the ship's surviving assistant navigator, Gaspar de los Reyes. He returned on 3 different occasions to the site of the wreck and enjoyed great success.
So much so that he made a few enemies, and the word got around that he didn't turn over to the king everything he recovered, but they couldn't come up with any hard evidence, so they finally let him go.
In 1682, Sir William Phipps, an English noble, attempted to salvage the Maravillas treasure and was unsuccessful. But 3 years later, he returned to the site of the wreck and pulled out several bushels worth of treasure. Phipps had brought along a map maker, and this was perhaps his greatest lasting contribution to the Maravillas saga. Phipps's map would be of great interest to treasure hunter Bob Marks 3 centuries later.
They did make a couple treasure maps, but remember, there's no longitude in the old days until chronometers came in at the end of the 18th century, so we only had a latitude. But it turns out that the latitude that they gave on the treasure maps, 27 degrees, 15 minutes, was only a half a mile from where I found it. So they were pretty good using an old-fashioned astrolabe to get it so precise.
In 1960, Bob Marks knew the early salvers had gotten but a tiny fraction of the Maravillas bounty and began his own efforts. But by 1972, he was frustrated. He'd already spent 12 years and hundreds of thousands of his investors' money searching for the Maravillas. While he was working other wreck sites to stay in business, he'd always come back during the warm summer months to search in the waters 40 miles off the Bahamas, where he thought the Maravillas might be. He was living out a boyhood dream, but he had no idea what a nightmare it would become.
It's like the treasure of Sierra Madre. Treasure destroys people's minds, it destroys friendships, and that's why I say treasure is trouble, and the more the treasure, the more the trouble.
And yet, Marks accepted the trouble as the cost of doing business. He was traveling back in time, chasing a dream. He pursued the Maravillas because he believed he had enough clues from a number of archival sources. Marks was still relying heavily on the account of Dr. Don Diego Portechuelo de Ribadeneyra.
In his account, he talked about how long it was after they hit a couple hundred feet of water before they hit the reef, where the other ship that rescued him and the other people the following morning, where they were exactly. So I had an idea that this Maravilla had to be within hailing distance because people on the bow of the Maravilla were screaming and were heard by the other ship. So there were little clues like that.
What may seem like a glamorous undertaking to those outside the world of treasure hunting is actually a difficult, tedious, and often dangerous endeavor. It takes a heavy toll on the mind, body, and spirit. But Marks believed enough in the value of his research that over the course of 12 years, he continued on in his quest for the Maravillas. For all the advances in salvaging available to treasure hunters today, back then, Marks and his crew relied primarily on the magnetometer, or MAG, which is basically an underwater metal detector to guide his search.
Bob has, in those early days, very tenacious, persevering qualities, and that's what it took to mag out there in the wild and woolly Los Mimbres, as the Spanish referred to Little Bahama Bank. And it's very boring and tedious work, but he had the tenacity to persevere, and he was successful because of it.
Being in salt water all day, your hands tend to shrivel up. Moving ballast rocks, your hands are soft because they're soaking in water all day. And then you're grabbing a rock with coral on it, and that tends to wear the skin off of your fingers. And after a while, your hands tend to get kind of like crab claws. They get very, very hard and calloused when they're out of the water.
Of course, nothing can punish the body quite like a shark.
All my life I wrote lies about sharks. I always wrote sharks don't bite. Well, I finally ran into one when I was chasing after the Maravilla that didn't read my books, and it was a big mako and attacked me, and I ended up with 268 stitches. Only the muscle, you could still see the teeth right there now. I had plastic surgery done on my arm 3 times, so you can't see it.
There were other problems to contend with, like the unpredictability of the ocean and the weather. There were also modern-day pirates.
A lot of times they actually fired on us with automatic weapons, and we'd fire back. We were fully armed. So we always had to have a 24-hour watch on, especially at night with the radar. And you never know what a boat is until you could identify the boat. We also had actual people out there that knew that I was going to eventually find that treasure, and their one aim was to get the treasure and take it away from me.
But Marks could not be frightened or dissuaded from pursuing his goal. His belief that he would one day find the treasure could not be shaken. And yet, despite his self-confidence, Marks was shocked when, after 12 years of searching, he finally found the wreck right where he'd begun his search.
I searched for the Maravilla for 12 years, and it turns out I actually found it the first day and didn't know it. Where I was working, it was 40 miles from the nearest land, and I needed a place to check my navigation instruments and my magnetometer. So my base on this bank was a place where there was hundreds and hundreds of fantastic dolphins all the time. And there was a modern wreck there from the 1940s, and it was sticking out of the sand.
Each morning, Marks's crew would make an initial pass with their magnetometer to make sure it was working. 100 yards from the 1940s wreck, they would get a reading, indicating the equipment was functioning. Marks assumed it was triggered by additional debris from the modern wreck, but he was wrong.
That was the Maravilla. So if the first day when I got the hit, if I would have dug a hole, I would have found it. So in '72, when I finally went out there, I was out there 3.5 months when I finally found it. And I only found it because we were anchoring near that same spot that we anchored every night. And the next morning, we picked up the anchor, and in the anchor, in the flukes, were 2 round Spanish ballast stones.
Ballast stones were huge rocks loaded onto the bottom of Spanish galleons to keep them balanced at sea.
So I found it by a total fluke. None of this scientific instruments and everything that people like to talk about.
But how did he know he'd found it? Marks relied on his extensive knowledge of the Maravilla's history. He recalled the fact that Dr. Diego had said the ship had lost an anchor and its rudder.
And one of the first things I found during the search for the Maravilla, which took over 12 years, was I found that anchor and parts of that rudder.
Marks was also able to match up silver bars that had specific markings with descriptions he'd found in the Spanish archives. But not everything was so cut and dry.
For example, when I brought up the first emerald, the damn thing was about the size of a ping pong ball. I was excited, and all my crew suddenly looked pale as church mouse. I said, "What's the matter?" And the guy said, "Oh, we've been finding these things for weeks. We thought it was glass bottles broken up." So we had to go redig those holes, and of course came up with 2 buckets full of emeralds.
As more and more treasure was brought up, treasure fever also surfaced, along with a host of other troubles. According to Marks, a crew member not only began pocketing the treasure for himself, but then sold the wreck's location to a rival group of treasure hunters. Marks says that led to trouble with the Bahamian government, which controlled the lease for the Maravillas. Marks claims the rival group went to the Bahamian government and offered to hand over a larger cut of the treasure than Marks was giving them in exchange for the lease. At that point, says Marks, in order to squeeze him out, the government accused him of hiding some of the treasure.
I started just taking the treasure to banks in the States, and in the end, they tried to arrest us. And when we outran them and got to Florida, they notified the U.S. Coast Guard that we were loaded with drugs. So when we got into Fort Pierce, they ripped the walls of the Coast Guard looking for the drugs. They weren't after the treasure that we had on board. So then I went on Cronkite Show, CBS Live, and I called the Prime Minister of the Bahamas a crook.
The Bahamian government responded by revoking Marks's lease The door was now open for a number of new treasure hunters, but only one of them would be successful. Only Herbert Herbo Humphreys Jr., president of Marex International, would reap rewards.
Got it now, bro?
But Marx was not entirely out of the picture. Humphreys realized that Marx knew more about the Maravillas than anyone else, so Humphreys asked him to work with Marex for a percentage, as a consultant. With no hope of ever securing another Maravillas lease again, Marx took the assignment. Marx provided valuable information that helped Humphreys in his quest to salvage the Maravillas treasure. Humphreys realized the value of key consultants, so he hired more. They helped him spread out his search to other areas that would yield positive results.
And head down and stay about 100 feet off of the edge so I can mag over towards the edge of the reef.
Once again, the treasure hunters looked to the history of the Maravillas and its fateful final voyage to determine where to look for more treasure.
We were able to determine the way the scatter pattern, the way the ship broke up, which direction that was going. So it was over a half a mile from where Bob had worked that we found our major gold sources. Gold bars, one piece weighed 32 pounds.
When the stern castle broke off on that fateful night, it drifted and settled, and over the years, the currents and the deterioration of the woods, the timbers, broke up and drifted. And the scatter trail of this great shipwreck goes for 4 miles.
It is the stern castle with its cache of smuggled riches that is the elusive mother lode sought by modern-day treasure hunters. Humphreys' salvage efforts benefited from improvements over the technology Bob Marx had utilized in the 1960s and 70s during his quest to find the Maravillas.
He just continued where I left off and the other people after me. He was more determined, he had a better boat and better crew, and he did have a bigger and more sophisticated metal detector that they could actually drag behind that helped find a lot of the gold bars.
There are other, more sophisticated devices available to the well-financed modern-day treasure hunter.
Another is side-scan sonar, which we use that can basically pick up a beer can at 1,000 feet. And that combined with sub-bottom profilers, which is like a ground-penetrating radar, can work underneath the sand, even better under mud, and show items that are down there.
All this technology doesn't come cheaply. Humphreys spent about $100,000 a month during active salvage operations of the Maravillas wreck sites.
The tides and the currents and the weather never cooperates. And the dangers of working underwater in open sea and currents is ever present. You have to have the vessels, you have to have the equipment, you have to have the support team, all of the logistical reinforcement that just goes on to successfully conclude an underwater search in ocean water.
One of the key devices Humphreys used in his underwater salvage operation was the blower, also called a mailbox, because that's what it looks like.
We are actually blowing holes with the mailboxes. A mailbox blows a jet stream into the sandy bottom. It then clears a hole in the sandy bottom of the ocean, of which our divers then descend into the hard pan with the handheld metal detectors, and they pick up any of the artifacts that are in the hole.
Humphreys and his crew's efforts eventually paid off when they began to pull up incredible pieces of treasure from the Maravillas. For him, the most magical moments of the adventure were seeing the treasures for the first time.
This couldn't be this great-looking cross with 66 cut emeralds in it, or this big pile of gold bars that have been sitting here since the 1650s, and you're the first one to look at them or touch them. Then, of course, you're thankful that you've been successful, and that your investors are going to get paid back and you're going to make some money out of the thing, and you're happy for your crews and employees, all of which get a percentage bonuses above their salaries. I'd just say it's an unbelievable feeling. It's hard to describe. It's like it's been said before, the stuff dreams are made of.
Not to mention healthy bank accounts. Humphreys amassed a wide range of fabulous treasures worth millions, including gold, silver, and amazing jewels. The most spectacular of all was the Emerald Cross, which would turn out to be the most expensive piece of jewelry ever salvaged from the Maravillas. Over time, a number of people have gotten rich salvaging the treasures that went down with La Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas. But others have benefited peripherally as well. As these treasures have come to the surface, they've also made the history of the colonialization of the New World come to life in a way that books could never achieve.
History came alive, like when I started picking up silver bars and even gold bars, and it had the owner's initials, and you can match it up with the records, and then who owned the bar. Then I'd go back to the documents and find out I had a deposition from this person. He survived the thing, and he told what happened, and stuff like that.
This was a fantastic time capsule of implements and tools, china, medical instruments, weapons, navigational instruments, as well as coins and jewelry and everyday aspects of people's lives you could look at.
Every piece of treasure seems to offer a glimpse at another facet of history.
This is a sampling of a 75-pound silver bar we found. The notch on the left side of the bar is called the assayer's bite. This is the Spanish government official that would go through this silver bar with an implement and take this piece out to prove the purity of the bar, and that was his commission for doing that.
The smaller silver bars told an entirely different story.
These small silver bars here would have been individual bars, probably contraband, as they have no markings on them, that would have been hidden in somebody's shoe or boot to get them through.
Humphrey's team also found golden ornaments bearing the cross of the Order of Santiago, which were recognitions of chivalry given to Spanish knights of the realm. These are reliquaries from priests that had holy relics inside of them. But items like these were never indicated on the ship's manifest.
It's very difficult to tell from the records exactly what the Maravillas carried. I've seen the manifest, and it's quite small. But one knows that it doesn't tell the whole story.
Before any Spanish galleon headed back to the Old World, a manifest, a detailed accounting of the people and goods aboard, was recorded in multiple copies. These were the official accounts of what treasures the Maravillas held.
The bulk of it was silver bars and silver coins, and of the silver coins there were over 3 million coins, but that's different denominations. Pieces of 8, pieces of 4, pieces of 2, which are smaller than a piece of 8.
But because the king was entitled to a tax, 1/5 of the treasure, there was a great deal of smuggling going on, because just like today, no one liked to pay taxes. As a result, there was always far more treasure aboard than the ship's manifest indicated. Nowhere in the manifest of the Maravillas is there any reference to all the gold or exquisite jewels that have been subsequently recovered.
Smuggling was going on all the time. So when we say there's 5 million pesos on the Maravilla, that's the registered treasure. There's probably 2 to 3 times that amount in gold.
In addition to smuggling, the colonial profiteers in the New World also took advantage of legal tax dodges.
One of the loopholes, and that's why we find so many gold chains, was both in Spain and Portugal, there was a law that anything that you wore on your body and you stepped ashore, you didn't have to pay taxes on it. You couldn't be in a chair now and have slaves lift you, and you couldn't have coins or gold bars in your pocket. It had to be jewelry. So in a lot of cases, we find these enormously long gold chains.
As the Spaniards were trading with the Far East in the port city of Manila, they brought, or rather wore, a great deal of jewelry back to Spain. These items were never declared on the manifest.
The jewelry that we found, all these fantastic things, were all from the Far East. All those big crosses, gold crosses with emeralds in it and brooches with emeralds, and all the gold chains, they were all from the Far East that we found on the wreck. Many, many, many different ones.
After the jewelry and other treasures of the Maravillas were brought up, they were then meticulously cataloged and appraised. Typically, the items were sold at auction in order to obtain the best possible prices. In the 17th century, the Maravillas cross, with 66 cut emeralds, would have been the property of a high-ranking church official or someone of great nobility. In 1992, it sold at auction at Christie's. The final price tag was $500,000. But the value of treasure isn't always gauged by its sparkle. Because each piece of treasure is also a piece of history, the curators of museums see great value in it, especially items like anchors, cannons, and navigational devices.
If an investor chooses to take part of his payoff in actual treasure, he may donate that, at least in the United States, to a museum and take a tax deduction at the appraised value rather than the acquired value. And that is an incentive for an investor to give it away, get some notoriety in his hometown, and also share something with the community.
There were other instances of donations, though somewhat out of the ordinary.
Two nobles who were the sons of the viceroy of Peru, who was like, you know, the highest representative of the Spanish government in Peru, they died from a cholera epidemic, and they were being shipped back in two big jars about almost 4.5 feet high, pickled in aguardiente, which is a type of brandy, for burial in the cathedral in Valladolid, Spain. So they were lost in the Maravilla. Well, I found both jars broken up, and I found all their bones and their skulls and everything. So we had a big ceremony. 300 and some years later, after these guys should have been buried in Valladolid, we take them back and we have a big ceremony burying them. So that's making history come alive, and that's the kind of things I love about shipwrecks.
The treasures of the Maravillas may have brought riches, fame, and a certain amount of satisfaction to modern-day treasure hunters. But with speculation running wild over what remains on the ocean floor, the quest goes on. The story of the Maravillas is one that began with men taking treasure from the New World and attempting to bring it back to the Old World. Presumably, they thought it would bring them happiness, financial freedom at the very least. But it didn't turn out that way. The list of troubles associated with the Maravillas is considerable. The drownings of 605 passengers, the disappearance and deaths of subsequent salvors, the difficulties encountered by nearly everyone whose fate crossed her path. And yet, all this did little to stop the quest for the Maravillas treasure, 3 centuries ago or even today.
It's a contagious sort of disease that permeates the mind, and nothing else, morals, character, integrity, nothing else seems to matter to some of these people other than the glory of the gold.
The Spaniards found between 5 and 10% officially. That means they also stole a lot. In fact, we know of that. A lot of treasure was stolen by the salvors. What we don't know is over the centuries how many other people found treasure.
Based on archival research that only he has seen, Marx believes there is a solid gold statue of the Madonna and Child out there whose worth would obviously be in the millions. While Marx is virtually alone in his belief in the existence of the Madonna, he feels it is a valuable incentive to keep looking for the treasure of the Maravillas.
We still haven't found the Madonna, and we still haven't found the bulk of the treasure. I'd say what I picked up, Humphreys picked up, and a few other people picked up. The Spaniards picked up 5%. All combined, we haven't picked up 7 or 8% what was lost. So the bulk of the treasure of the Maravilla is still out there.
I don't believe there was ever a golden Madonna aboard the ship in the first place, but I could certainly be wrong. They may one day find a golden Madonna, but I just am a little skeptical about that possibility.
All of the treasures from the Madonna.
Herbert Humphreys Jr. is also skeptical about a golden Madonna, but he does agree on one point, that there is still a great deal of treasure yet to be salvaged.
The hope is, for our company, is to one day in the near future be able to go back there with technology that's just become available in the last 3 to 4 months and go to the areas that we know are still hot. I would say there's probably between $150 to $350 million in real value left out there.
While there is disagreement over just how much of the Maravilla's treasure remains, there's no doubt that at some point, when the Bahamian government agrees to lease the site once again, the quest will resume. And those who choose to invest will be looking for more than just the bottom line.
It's a different kind of investment for them than such an investment in IBM stock. This gives them the romance of the story. This gives them a possible piece of the history. It has other characteristics that add to its investment appeal other than just its total bottom line return. And part of what we do is romantic. That's what we provide to people.
Sometimes the romance is all.
There's a state of mind you have to get into with all this stuff, as far as I'm concerned. And the way to succeed with it is to forego the desire to possess these things. If you want to possess them, you're in for trouble. There's just trouble that comes with it when you get it. If you're there for the adventure and you accept that as your whole goal for going and doing these things, you'll find it very rewarding.
Whether it's the Maravillas or a wreck off the coast of Colombia or Ecuador, the search for Spanish riches goes on. The desire for more is unquenchable, no matter what the consequences.
Man is actually the most dangerous thing in the sea, depending on the way he wants to conduct himself. So troubles can occur, but most of the time we bring them on ourselves.
But after a lifetime of searching for treasure and making millions in the process, Bob Marks offers cautionary advice for anyone seeking to travel in his wake.
I've profited more than anybody in the world from finding treasure, but it's changed. The whole cup of tea has changed in the last few years. It's almost impossible to do this stuff now.
Marks says that too many governmental regulations are stifling the industry, and the maverick days of treasure hunting are over.
My advice to somebody who wanted to go treasure hunting, I'd say go to the bank, get $100,000 in paper bills, go out in a fancy yacht with a lot of booze, have a party, and let the wind blow the money away. That's what I'd say. It'd be the same. It would save you all the aggravation of dealing with governments, pirates, crooks, dopers, and idiots. If you want to throw your money away, do it the way, have a party.
Chances are few will take Marx's cynicism at face value, for the lure of treasure is a mighty thing. 500 years ago, conquistador Hernando Cortez spoke honestly when he said, "We Spaniards suffer from a disease that can only be cured with gold." there's just one problem. When you're in the throes of treasure fever, that cure is only temporary.